So the structure tonight is James Trapp and I are going to have a little bit of a conversation about Shadow of the Hunter. If you've read Shadow of the Hunter, wonderful. If you haven't, that's all right. Maybe this will make you want to read it. And then after about 30 minutes or so, we can go into breakout rooms of about 4 or 5. I've got some questions that you can cover in the breakout rooms if you want to, but you absolutely don't have to. Like I said, you can cover anything you want to talk about or anything else that you've thought about this book. I always personally like to start with, did I like the book or not? And I think that's a good way to get in. So I'm Caitlin. I do a bunch of work in translated literature. I run a festival called Goyle Huff. And then, as I mentioned, with me is Daniel Lee from Sinoist and Ying from Sinoist. Then this month's book is written by Tong, who's the author of Wives and Concubines, and he won the Mal Dunn Literature Prize for, I am right in saying it was this book under a different name, wasn't it, Daniel? Yellowbird Story.
Yes, I actually have the original galley that we printed here.
Gorgeous. Gorgeous. So yeah, a little bit of an insight into behind the scenes of publishing there. So we also have with us, lovely to see Yuan and He, who were proofreaders and worked on this book. And so hopefully you might be in a breakout room later with them and you'll get to sort of hear some more input on how that how proofreading is and what they thought of the book. And you know, I think after the translator, proofreaders are the people who next know the book as well as possible. So anyway, with me this evening we have James Trapp, who is a retired China education manager at the British Museum. Okay. Oh, sorry, Claudia, I'm just going to have to mute you. James Trapp was a retired China education manager at the British Museum, retired most recently from primary network coordinator at the Institute of Education at the Confucius Institute, and he has multiple translations to his name. And thank you so much, James, for joining us.
Oh, pleasure. That's a challenging pleasure with this book, but a pleasure.
Yeah, it really is. It's a challenging book in lots of ways, and I guess the first place I wanted to start with is, how did you come to translate this book? Did Ying approach you, or was it one that you pitched to Sinoist?
No, Ying asked me. I'd previously done 2 very long and very complex historical novels for ACA. And then Ying asked me if I'd take on this, which was really quite an honor, because it's a very prestigious book and a very prestigious author. I mean, Su Tong is one of the best known writers still working in China at the moment. So it was slightly daunting, even more daunting when I saw the text, I have to say. But we got through.
So for people who maybe haven't read the book, actually, like, everyone do a wave if you have. I've read the book. Anyone else? Yeah. Oh, quite a few people. Little bits and bobs. I see you there, Gabrielle. So a little summary is that it's oh gosh, how would I?
Yeah, I was afraid you were going to ask me, but please go ahead.
I'll go for it. I'll take the bullet. I would say that it follows 3 central characters from puberty and looks at an act of violence and the violence that they themselves have experienced around childhood, and then the violence, an act of sexual violence that then has ramifications through to their adulthood, and it follows them through their lives, as it were.
Yeah, I think you have to say 3 young characters and 1 old one as well, because I think the grandfather has to be included as a major character who somehow kind of ties the book together. He certainly bookends it, beginning and end.
And for you, what, obviously the stories are interlinked and bookended, but would you say that the grandfather is the heart of the story? Is it the one that you, like, when you were writing, was there anything that was feeling more important to convey? You know, more sort of, as we translate, things change naturally, and was there any story out of the stories that stayed for you as the core?
it's very difficult. The grandfather is kind of underpins the whole thing. He's not there all the time, but he resurfaces, and he's a kind of constant current of, and in fact, the one sort of almost immutable in the book, whereas the other three go through lots of different phases. Of the three, there are two young men and a young girl who at the beginning. Of their stories, I think that it's fairy princess Miss Bai, who is rarely the central theme in lots of ways, and the other two sort of run around her, both metaphorically and physically. So yes, but it's a very difficult book to pin down. I mean, I did not long after it was published, I did another book group, I think, and I was asked, one of the questions was, and then there were three of us pitching different novels, that's right, trying to persuade people to read our particular novel, and the question was, well, what's it about? And I simply couldn't answer, really, because it's about so many things. There isn't a continuous narrative, really, and there are so many themes that are picked up, woven together, picked apart, abandoned, picked up again, that it's very hard to say what it's about. I think but the effects of childhood or teenage trauma, I suppose, would be one way of looking at it. Yes, but it's. I think of it as, I don't think of it as dark, but I kind of, there's a physical theme that runs through. There's a river that plays quite an important part at once in the book, and I kind of, the light that I get when I'm thinking about the book is like light that's been filtered through water. It's sort of slightly indistinct, little sort of dark tinge, but with patches of light. It's very difficult, but and a slight fuzziness to the edges somehow sometimes. It's a very, very atmospheric book, but as you can see, I'm struggling to define exactly what that atmosphere is.
For me, some of that fuzziness and maybe the filter that sort of through which it's read is also that its tone is almost humorous. Like, you know, despite dealing with very dark subject matter and it plot wise, it's certainly a very dark book, but actually the way in which it's told to you, you know, there's a slight level of absurdism, you know, like everyone's running around talking about how they've lost their souls, or like I read that as almost humor. Would you say that the narrative voice is a bit distinct from the plot?
I'm not sure you can really separate them. I think you just, but yes, I mean, there are all sorts of different types of humor. I mean, there's outright slapstick stuff in there. You know, when the grandfather's rushing around with his shovel digging up holly bushes and so on. There's, yeah, and the language is interesting. There's an underlying, or you feel that it's being presented with a degree of wry humor. I think is about as far as I would go. I wouldn't say there are any laugh out loud patches in it. Maybe there are. No, I don't think. But yes, certainly the darkness, and it is very dark as a story. Doesn't overpower you partly because of the way it's narrated, and because of different elements and so on, and partly because of the elements of absurdity that you mentioned. Some of it just seems frankly bizarre, and it's quite difficult. I mean, you have an episode with a circus and a horse. I mean, it all, things come at you unexpectedly. I think that's more what it is. It keeps you off balance, but without ever quite, not fully bamboozling you. So it moves at an extraordinary pace. And it, as I say, keeps throwing things at you, but always there is this element of wry humor in it.
Were you
No.
off balance translating it? How was the actual process itself? Was it smooth sailing, or was it as difficult as it is to sort of pin down?
It wasn't an easy text to get into. And also because it changes as it goes on, and it starts off quite innocently. Or not quite, well, it's not terribly, because it talks about the grandfather trying to kill himself. But it starts off as almost as someone telling a story. And there is a narrator telling a story, but somehow it escapes from that. And when I think of it, I was actually checking. I went back to check the text because I know that Tong, he likes to use some, which I think semi-classical techniques. Like he doesn't mark direct speech. He doesn't always use personal pronouns to indicate he's speaking some. And I had this kind of feeling that he almost doesn't use punctuation, but I went back and checked, and he does. But the way it flows, and it's in the nature. You see it more. It's more obvious if you watch Chinese movies. Why am I saying movies? I'm not American. Chinese films, and for a Western. Westerners who are not used to Chinese films, the editing is really weird, and where Chinese films they don't use the sort of segue and the merging shots and so on. They jump. You finish one thing, move into another, and it's quite, for a Western audience, it's quite difficult to see where the breaks or to expect the breaks. And there's an element of that in this book. It keeps moving on, and it can catch you off balance with the way it moves. Linguistically, it's quite dense prose. It's not the easiest I've come across, but it's very elegant. It's very, I think elegant's the right word. If I come up with a better word, I'll use it. I mean, it's beautifully written. But yeah, it took me a while to get into it, and then to realize what was going on. So yeah, it was a challenging text.
Was there anything in particular, the sort of one that I know a lot of translators talk about, because it's sort of a good example of this kind of dilemma, is swearing. How, because you know, different swear words are so rooted in a particular area often, they have so many different connotations, and how was translating, for example, the swearing in this?
It's very frustrating, because when you come to do it, you realize just what a poor vocabulary of swear words we have in English. I mean, there are about 4 that we use constantly, and Chinese is very rich in its, and they're not always, and they're not obvious to West. I mean, but the use of eggs and dogs and dog farts and so on, and in lots of different permutations, is quite challenging, and you can't. If you went into into dialect, perhaps you could. So if I suddenly, I live in Hounslow, and I suddenly went into sort of street Hounslow, I could do it, but it would make no sense. Or if I was in Yorkshire or whatever. So it's actually quite limiting. So you just you end up falling back on quite a small vocabulary, and then you just try and manipulate a little bit, but it is frustrating because it's very difficult to be as graphic in English as the Chinese is. I don't mean graphic, I mean image graphic. So yes, that is a frustration. And I have to say, I still surprise myself sometimes with what I can come up with when I put my mind to it. But
yeah. And was there anything else that stood out as a translation problem from this specific book that was harder? I would imagine translating history books is obviously very different to translating a fiction. Was there anything about the setting or the tone or the language here that also presented a problem?
It's quite difficult to remember, because I've translated about 5 books since, going back. It was the structure was sometimes puzzling, and you had to sit back, or I had to sit back and unpick it a bit. And I don't know whether it's using. He doesn't use classical. In some of the historical novels I've done, the authors sort of fall back on using fairly classical forms and so on. I don't think you can say that Tong does that, but I think there's a consciousness of classical literature in there. And you have to, I mean, because all Chinese is elliptical by Western standards in what it doesn't say that we say in terms of tenses and I think there are areas where that's quite exaggerated in the way Tong writes, so that you have to be very aware of the context all the time, because it's from the context that you will get the meaning. I mean, that's true of all Chinese, but I think it's slightly more so with certainly with this novel, working back and looking at context.
When you say elliptical, could you elaborate on that a bit? Because ellipses came up with Li Duan last month, and how like she always puts loads of ellipses in a way that is just really unfamiliar from specifically a British reading perspective. You just don't see ellipses used that much.
Yeah.
It's not the same thing, but
I mean, it's the when I'm trying to explain this the way that I understand Chinese working, I tend to look at classical Chinese landscape painting. And if you can imagine a Chinese landscape scroll, compare it to a Western landscape. A Western landscape, every square inch of the canvas is covered in intricate detail. So the artist is showing you precisely what to see. It's absolutely defined. If you look at a classical Chinese landscape scroll, you'll see that up to 50% even of the paper or the silk is blank. There's no ink on it, but you're still able to read the landscape, even though it's not precisely defined, because of where those blanks are, what's surrounding them. So if there's a fish in the middle of then it's or ripples, it's water, if you mist, clouds, and so on. It's all there. Your brain just has to work differently to interpret it. So the potential is that everybody who looks at a Chinese landscape painting is seeing a slightly different painting, because they are interpreting these cues. Whereas if you look at a Western painting, you'd be able to describe it precisely, and you come up with some. The language, to an extent, has elements of that, because it doesn't have, in English we have this intricate grammar. We have tenses, cases, singulars, plurals, genders in some Western languages, and so on. And we use this grammar to give precision of meaning. Whereas Chinese, if you go back to classical Chinese and early classical Chinese, there are no definable parts of speech. There's no punctuations, and words work. You get their meaning from the context and the combinations in which they're used, and that's still the case. So in Chinese you don't have tenses as such, but you can always tell, or almost always tell. If you say tomorrow I go Beijing or whatever, then it's in the future, because you've got tomorrow that tells you that. And you don't use plural. Why do you need plurals to define? If you said two or many or a few or whatever, it's plural. So why do you need to change the word? And things like that. So you're working in context, with context much more. There was an experiment done. Sorry, you have to tell me to shut up, because once I start talking, I don't.
Great.
An experiment done in the States, in which a group of Chinese students and a group of American students were shown exactly the same picture to look at. I think it was a picture of a pilot in the cockpit in midair with other planes all around him. And they had computer programs tracking the eye movements of the students as they looked at it. The Western students zeroed in on what they thought was the focal point of the picture, the pilot, and then looked around them, whereas the Chinese students looked all round the picture first before focusing. So they were looking at the whole context of the picture before focusing on detail, whereas we tend to focus on detail first. I don't know if that's any kind of answer. I can't remember what the question was even, but it's interesting stuff, I think. And that, yes, so it's use of context, that's what it was, wasn't it? So yes, and I think when I got stuck on places here, I had to go back and look around, as it were, for the clues that were there, the cues that were there to give me the meaning of that particular piece. It's always there, but as a Westerner, you don't always pick up on it first time. So you have to go back, oh, right, I see, that's okay, so that means that, and so on.
Do you think that the book changes so that the your English version, do you think that because it has been written in English intrinsically has you know, the way our language is structured, the way we might tend to use sentences changes some of that context? I think, you know, obviously this is
I think it probably, I think some of the subtle, I think inevitably, I mean, inevitably in translation subtleties are going to be lost, and one feels, and then the trick is to lose as few as possible. So I think certainly some of the changes in tone that are there in the Chinese are not so clear in the, they're not so easy to make in the English. I mean, you're conscious of a change in voice as you read it, and it changes from a comparatively normal start, the opening chapter, then it keeps evolving and keeps changing and so on. And I mean, partly you get that because the story changes so much, and the different viewpoints you're getting change so much. But I suspect some of the subtleties are, well, I'm sure some of the subtleties are lost in translation.
Do you think there's anything that you can point to as having been added? You know, not necessarily sort of for the better or for the worse, but like, you know, something that's different that is sort of...
I hope not. No, ideally not. So I mean, if there is, it was unconscious, because you know, obviously the whole aim of a translator is to get as close to what they feel the original is. And if I've misread that, then that's my problem. But no, I can't. I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't. No, I certainly wouldn't claim to have improved it in any way. I hope I didn't change it too much.
Something that really stood out to me was the symbolism in here. So we have like ropes. We have like, there's a very obvious one of ropes and the water tower in particular. But at one point, I think the ropes get compared. So Beirun, who's one of our central characters, his sort of weapon is not the right word. The way in which
it's his means of expressing himself, to, yeah, essentially, bizarre as it seems. It's his skill in bondage is his way of expressing himself, and for initially proving himself useful in society, because he finds work in the mental hospital restraining patients, and then he's able to restrain it. But you know, that, I mean, it's fairly weird to start with, and it just gets weirder as he starts tying his grandfather up and taking him for walks and so on. And then, but then it culminates, all this weirdness culminates in this the very dark passage in the water tower. For those of you, I don't know how many people haven't read it, but the three young protagonists, Baorun, Fairy Princess, and Liu Sheng, end up, they have a complex three-way relationship, but they end up in this water tower in the grounds of a mental hospital. I mean, it sounds weird as you talk about it, and Baorun, who has been obsessed with the girl Fairy Princess from quite a young age, and then as puberty hits, the obsession clearly becomes more sexual. But Baorun only he limits himself to tying her up, which sounds bad enough, but he doesn't assault her, whereas the other boy, who's the manipulator, actually does, as we understand it, physically assault the girl. So the ropes are both his way of expressing himself, but they also serve, it seems to me, to restrain him. They're his way of restraining himself and his worst impulses as well. If he didn't have ropes to tie people up, who knows what he might have done. I think there's part of that there. But I mean, it's strange stuff.
There's a sentence, I think, where someone compares Beirun's use of ropes to their use of pesticides, or there's something about like a violence, but you know, choosing pesticides rather than ropes, or choosing and I guess that for me, I think that it's, you know, we're not meant to sympathize with either of the perpetrators of violence, but we also understand how they've come to be in the position they are.
I think Baorun is slightly more sympathetic than his partner in crime, who has very few redeeming features.
But I feel like this was an intentional comparison to the pesticides and to us understanding sort of a bit of their lives, was this understanding that actually this is a story of many. Would you say that's sort of an accurate reading?
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember the pesticide comparison, but yeah, I know this. It's not simply a story of individuals, and we're made aware by other elements of the kind of social pressures that are surrounding them. Both the social pressures of on young adolescents, but also the pressures that are in society at the time, with Bowden's time in prison, and the police screeching up in their jeeps and so on to arrest him. So and the general uncertainty of the time, and this is where Grandpa comes in, I think, because he's very much he's old China, an old generation, with his strange beliefs about spirits and so on. But in the end, he's the one who survives, because he has a solid foundation, however outdated or however strange it may be, that holds him together. Whereas it strikes me that the other three have nothing. They're constantly changing. They're constantly trying to find some way of expressing themselves, of settling down and so on, and conspicuously failing generally in the end. Whereas he has this underlying solidity that seems to keep him, in the end, despite everything he goes through, impervious, and he ends up there sitting with his what would be his great grandson, or great. We don't even know the sex of Baby Rage, I don't think. But the book ends with him with the next generation in his arms, and everyone else has gone away. So he's the thing that's holding it all together, whereas the others are struggling with all the changes.
And the others, like, something that really strikes me about Miss Bay's life, the fact that we never get her I mean, I guess her government name's maybe not that important, Fairy Princess is the one she chooses and all this sort of thing. But actually, like, it's not just her childhood that is violent, but actually, I think one of the things I was reading from the sort of older characters that are in that as well is that every stage of life has its equal opportunity for violence, and it's sort of unrelenting in this way, and nobody's escaping it at all.
Yeah, I mean, she has no foundations at all, and is constantly changing, because she starts off as she's adopted and something, and she has to constantly reinvent herself to survive, and she's entirely rootless, but a survivor. And I think that's interesting, because of the three, I think she's the central character of the three, and the one who has, although she's constantly changing, she's always there, and she always seems to come out on top. We don't know what happens to her in the end, but each time she seems to find some way of escaping from one incarnation, as it were, into another, and we must presume that that's what she goes on doing. Whereas the other two boys seem to be stuck with themselves, and that's their undoing, because they aren't able to change their fundamental nature.
Yeah. No, I take that really. Do you know, that's interesting, because I think I read the ending. I didn't necessarily think of her as having moved on and reinvented herself. I maybe took it as a bit darker.
I think that's up to you. And yeah, I mean, which could be the final onward move, but she rejects killing herself once and has the child. We don't know. I mean, unless I'm forgetting something of vital importance at the end of the book.
No, it's definitely not. I don't think. Well,
she's supposed to go and see the doctor, but she ends up leaving. But no, she's disappeared before.
Yeah. And
reappeared as something else. So, but it could be. I think, again, the thing about this book is there are no certainties at all. You can't say with certainty pretty well anything about any of the characters, which is a remarkable feat of I mean, that is their characterization, and so it's a remarkable thing that it just keeps you wondering, it keeps you moving, keeps you on edge. Actually, I mean, you spend a lot of time reading this book on sort of on edge, not necessarily out of the excitement, but just thinking, what's going on, what's going to happen next, how did that happen? It's that kind of book, and just thinking, God, this is weird.
Yes. Did that sort of change at all as you know, from first time reading it to like now when it's in the past?
Yeah, I think I'm slightly more reconciled to it. I found it a very hard book to begin with, but it kind of settles down. But it is a book that needs several readings, I think. I mean, not everyone's going to do that, and you'll get a lot of very interesting stuff out of just the one reading, and all sorts of insights into ways of seeing things we hadn't thought of. But the patterns, if there are any, only define themselves over time, I think. And it's only quite recently that some of the things I've been talking about here have sort of solidified in my thinking about it. I would have been if we'd held this book club immediately after I translated it, I would have had much less to say about it, oddly, even though it would have been much fresher in my mind.
Yeah. Well, on that note, would everyone else like to have the opportunity to talk about their experiences of the book? Thank you so much, James. That was really, really interesting. Thank you so much. What we're going to do now is split up into breakout rooms. So Daniel is going to assign them. A pop-up will come up on your screen and you just have to click accept. They'll be about 10-15 minutes long, and I will copy and paste some questions in the chat you can use now if you would like to. And after the breakout rooms, if you want to nominate anyone from your group to feedback, but everybody's welcome to speak and pitch in. It's very much open, but yeah, and just in case we don't want to miss any of the groups.
There are 3 rooms of 5 and 2 rooms of 6. I'm just going to open them now.
And if anyone has any problems, you can just click leave breakout room and you can come back here and we'll help you out, or like can drop into your room or anything like that. So
middle of the section.
Excellent, as it were. So I'll just wait for everyone to come back through. Hello, everyone. I hope you had a good chat. So I think we've got a few more we're still waiting on too. Let's have a look.
Who seems to want to continue this conversation to the last minute, I think.
We're having a great conversation.
I look at Daniel's and his background. It's very interesting. He looks like a Su Tong, you see?
Yeah.
And the two, like a twin brothers.
Su Tong, the younger version.
Daniel's famous Su Tong impersonation. Yeah.
I wish he had.
Look at that.
I'll write a film-worthy novel shortly.
Yes, write a best-selling novel and the film script as well. That will do nicely.
I already have a publisher, so that's nice.
Yeah. There's some very critical editors there.
Oh yes, indeed.
And as for Anna Bromankova, I watched the Midsummer's Murder a lot. It's a very famous British TV series, right? She looks like one of the girls. Yeah, the daughter of that detective.
An actress. All right. Well, I hope everybody had an interesting conversation. Here we were just talking a little bit more about how there was a lack of joy in the book, and Ying was also talking about how like everything that James said suddenly clicked for her and her reading of the books as well. So would anybody like to speak first? Is anybody nominated to speak for their groups?
Can I speak first? People might be curious why I'm here. And when I was asking the group, have you read this? I said, I read every word of it. Because I was asked to read it. And that, I think, started from my my start from 史铁生's 丁一之旅, Ding Yi's Odyssey, and Wang Laoshi asked me to read it, to read the translation, to make sure if all the strange threads, Eve and Adam escaped from Eden and got into people's souls, even into a mother's womb, and then start a life with someone like a Ding Yi, from when he was born till he's dead. Sometimes the soul is speaking, sometimes the character is speaking. So it's kind of very entangling. And so Wang Laoshi asked me to read it to see if he got it right. But at that time, I was overdoing myself because that was the first time I worked for Wang Laoshi. I tried to prove myself. So I also read into the language and then the culture. We agree on the culture part of it. And finally, I found something, but I have to find something to prove myself. And like just now, Trapp talked about cursing, right? In China, different people from different regions, they have a whole set of different cursing words. Like a Guangdong says "sui zai," a bad guy, and so in Beijing, it's grandson, 孙子. But you can't translate it simply into 孙子. It would be absurd, ridiculous for two young people, for one to call the other, "Hey, 孙子." Grandson, no, it's a curse word.
Yeah.
So after that, Wang Laoshi said, well, maybe she can develop a system for two people from different cultural backgrounds to work together. So she asked me to read some of the authors, and so I learned a lot from them because my English, as you can hear, is not authentic. It's not my native language. So, but when I translate Zhang Wei's Songs from the Forest, I think it's an advantage for me to be born almost the same year as the author. So we lived through the whole Cultural Revolution, everything she wrote about in code languages. And so that's why I was asked to read James' book, and I learned a lot from him. He became my teacher. Yeah, I wish my English would be as good as that. So of course, even Homa knots, we all make the same mistakes sometimes when we translate. We miss a paragraph or two. So I'm glad I picked up one, and yeah. So generally, I think I learned a lot from it, and I'd like to do that again. If you would like to.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Oh, one day I wish
Thank
we
you,
could
Mr.
try.
Yuan. Yeah, Mr. Yuan is talking about 丁一之旅. I mean, that book, James, you wouldn't want to even go anywhere close that. In Chinese, I read it in Chinese. Even in
It's
Chinese,
so involving.
I
Yeah.
cannot really figure out what Shi Tiesheng tried to say there.
Mhm.
And it's sort of like it's a spirit to grow into another body, the body, his spirit talking to himself, and then he himself tried to talk back, not in the dream, but in
Yeah, I
real
know.
life, which, oh my God, it is very,
I know. Sometimes it's in himself, in the character.
Yeah,
Sometimes it's
that's right.
detached from him and talk to him. I know,
Yeah.
and talk to others. It's really
Unfortunately,
confusing.
we cannot asking Shi Tiesheng any questions now. And I wish I tried very hard to try to contact his wife, but we can't figure out what he tried to deliver.
For the sake of times, I'm so sorry. For the sake of
Sorry.
time, yes, sorry. For the sakes of time, let's sort of come back to Shadow of the Hunter, or sort of to the discussions people were having. And I was wondering, I know that Honey and Max were in a group together. I don't suppose I can call on you, Honey. Would you like to say anything first? What were you talking about?
Sure, it'd be a pleasure. funnily enough, Tong was actually with me at NYU at the time Shadow of the Hunter came out, because I was translating a collection of his short stories. And so I was just talking with Max about how Tong gave me a proof copy of Shadow of the Hunter. And so I was reading it at the same time as translating his short stories. And I was feeling a real sense of translator solidarity, I suppose, with James, because I could feel you going through all the same difficulties with English that I was going through. Yeah. Because, you know, Tong, it's clear in everything he writes. He vacillates and waxes between this really high, beautiful poetic register to stunning, immediate, shocking brutality that can be really quite ridiculous and like banally absurd and funny, like James was saying, slapstick sometimes. And so I find that there is a real difficulty, not only in preserving those two different registers and the change in register, but showing an English language reader that this is intentional, that the author is doing this on purpose. This is a literary technique. It's not weird. Well, it is weird. It's weird on purpose. I always find that that's the most difficult thing to convey. And I think, James, you did a spectacular job of it. And
more by accident than design, I think, but thank you anyway. But I think what you say about, I think the despite all the difficulties, the advantage of sort of is that he pulls you along. He sort of, and he pulls you. It's not a novel that sits naturally in English, or but he pulls you into thinking. You have to think about it and how you're going to do it. So I think that in most of the credit for the translation goes to the author, I would say, in many ways. Not always true. Sometimes one has to work to improve slightly. Some work, but not with him. You just let it go, I think.
No, I'm sorry, I do not agree on that. I in a way, I always say to my author, the translator and author in different languages is a 3-7 开, 70%, 30%. 70% going to the translator and 30% going to the original author. The way I feel strongly about this is because, you know, a good translator can really bring out the deep, even better meaning, you know, delivery into the language that they use, or they can totally screw the author.
Yeah.
Because if you choose a wrong translator, doesn't matter how brilliantly, you know, the original work is. I mean, you can basically screw it as bad as you can imagine. So no. I always talk to the author. I say to them, you know, I know you are very famous. You win a lot of prize in China. You know, you are sort of like any book you publish, it's just go like crazy. But, you know, when you are doing another language, 70% of the output.
You're in our hands. Yes.
Good or bad, good or bad.
The power of the translator.
Anyway,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt.
Actually, may I add something? It's Fan Wu here, because I'm a writer and I also I've done my own translation too. So I have to say, James and Honey and you guys have done amazing jobs. It's really difficult to translate certain Chinese writers. And Tong, I've been reading Tong since I was a middle school student. Okay, I think his writing is very poetic. And he also, he likes to use a lot of symbols. He has a lot of images. So certain things are difficult to translate. I think the translatability is not just about language itself. It's about the mood. It's about the characteristics. It's about the style. It's about so many things. And for a writer like Tong, his language it's almost like water sometimes. It's a fluid. And I know in my breakout room, and I was talking to my partners and Mo Yan's writing. A lot of time Mo Yan use a lot of dialects, but those dialects, once you understand their meanings, they are pretty clear. But for Su Tong's, sometimes certain words he used can have multiple meanings, and you have to almost, even as a native speaker, I have to go back to the writing to read a couple of times because the mood and the language are often connected together. So that I think is something really interesting about Su Tong's writing. In my breakout room, and we also talk about, because James earlier mentioned a lot about the story. It's almost like the characters have no foundation, right? And they're all survivals. So Caitlin, you asked a great question about who is the victim. I think it's a 螳螂捕蝉，黄雀在后. That's a Chinese saying, right? It's like when a mantis is trying to catch a cicada and a canary is behind it, right? But I think to me, it's like everyone's trapped, right? No one has,
I think.
everyone's trapped, right? Who is what? It's really hard to define. But that's exactly what China was going through at the time. China is still going through that. I mean, like Yu Hua basically has said, Yu Hua is one Chinese writer I really admire, deeply admire. I also like Su Tong very much. But Yu Hua said what China has gone through in the past 40, 50 years, it's like what Europe has gone through in the past 400 years. That's very, very true, because it just all this dramatic change within such short time has created a lot of uncertainty. So a lot of times, people feel like they are pushing forward. No one has time to digest. So that's why in this book, I think in many Su Tong's books, in Yu Hua's books, in many other Chinese books, you see this kind of uncertainty. You see this kind of like frustration, and at the same time, you have no idea what's going to happen next. So that goes also to the open-ended ending, open ending, right? Because what's going to happen next? No one knows. So things are still happening. Even nowadays, things are still happening. No one can have a final say. So that's what I kind of wanted to what James was talking about earlier.
I remember going regularly, sort of 2 or 3 times a year to China between about 2004 and 2010. And at the point when the change was happening at such enormous pace, so you suddenly picked up speed, and you actually you could feel the bewilderment as you walked around, this feeling of uncertainty, because things were just changing so fast. And it wasn't just ways of thinking, new technology, even the road you lived in would change from 1 month to the next, because a whole load of buildings would disappear and a new road. So and that thinking in those terms, yes, this never having losing a solid foundation that previously was there. There's nothing, and you don't know, you're unsure what's going to come next. And that's that kind of, it's like, not butterfly, sort of feeling in the pit of your stomach is something of the feeling the book gives you, I think.
Anna, did you want to go next?
I just want to kind of go over what we discussed as a group, because I think we all had fun talking about the book and stuff. So one of the things that we all thought was interesting about the first few chapters was the way the sort of, I suppose, slightly spiritual element of talking about, the soul and stuff, how much it was kind of almost like a concrete reality for the characters, especially for the granddad, talked about as if it was just a part of normal life, which was like absurd in a way, but like quite interesting, and which we thought sort of might be a cultural difference, but also then Ran raised a good point that like it was kind of strange for her to living in China, but and it was kind of talked about, but as a joke more than like a real thing, in a sense. So it's kind of like a thing about an older generation, I suppose, that kind of spiritual element. That's some of the things that sort of went on to talking about like differences between how we found the book from a Western or from a Chinese perspective. And one of the interesting things that Gabrielle brought up was how the idea that taking a picture can steal your soul is quite like a culturally specific thing, but comes up in different cultures. Like I think, Gabrielle, you were saying it was in Egypt, right? That was the same idea that
it's a big thing in Egyptian culture too.
Which is also pretty interesting. Yeah, and then I thought that sort of one of the things that kind of is not necessarily unique to Chinese culture, but can resonate across, is how there's like the kind of uprooted sense is partly to do with like rapid commercialization and kind of business and stuff, which in a way is relevant in lots of different countries. For example, for me, with family in Russia, there was a similar kind of uprooted sense of commercialization taking over the world very quickly. So I think that's kind of translates across. Yeah, then we also discussed a little bit about the fable behind the novel, as Fan mentioned, the Cicada, the mantis, the oriole, and Ryan raised an interesting point that she's in some criticism about how there's this question of who is the hunter and who is the hunted and stuff, but the one that actually survives is the granddad, precisely because he isn't being watched by anyone, because he's neglected by the world. No one is kind of, because of being abandoned in that way, he is not hunted in a sense and survives. So yeah, that's some of the things that we talked about.
Oh, that sounds awesome. That's really, really interesting. I think the question of like the applicability of certain like themes and feelings, I certainly related to it, you know, in a very human way. Is there anyone else who'd like to go and speak? I've seen a few familiar faces. I don't suppose I could convince Lucy or Debbie or Ran to speak at all, could I? Oh, Lucy, you're muted, sorry. I think, and then... There you go.
Yeah, I cannot say a lot because I haven't even finished reading it, but I must say it's one of the most beautiful books I have read in the past 2 years. And I started reading it in Chinese, which was quite daring, and I gave up very quickly because it's too much I didn't understand. But then having it alongside the translation, it made me realize what a beautiful translation you've done, James. And I really admire it. I thought it was beautiful. I could feel the same in the Chinese as I could feel in your English. And I thought it was really nice. But then that distracted me a lot. So I'm at 60%. But I think it's such a complicated book. There's so much in it. It's so rich. And there is a lot that I will never understand because I'm not Chinese and I haven't got the culture and information I would need. But I thought it was beautiful. And I thought, well, it really is great that you people have translated it and published it. And I hope that more Western readers will become interested in Chinese literature because there is a lot in it. And it's really quite special. It's quite an adventure to start reading Chinese literature.
I'm not sure I'd necessarily recommend this as the very first foray into contemporary Chinese literature, but yeah. But well, thank you for those kind words as well. I mean, it's just the great translating is just a joy, essentially. And hearing and appreciated is even better. But thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy. I'm sure Daniel and Ying are very pleased to hear and have all their hard work rewarded. And would anybody else like to go? I know, Esther, you were here last time. Can I convince you to speak? That's absolutely fine. No worries at all. No worries. And would anybody else? Yeah, absolutely. Go on. Angus, you're up next.
Hello. Okay, I'm going to do something a little bizarre, given that we're doing Sutong. I heard mention of Songs from the Forest, another great Sinoist book published by Sinoist Books. Its Chinese name is Hedgehog Song. Principal characters are hedgehogs. So I thought I'd introduce my little spiky daughter. Millie, there she is. She's shy, actually. She needs to go back. But yeah, you should all go buy Songs from the Forest because it's a book about hedgehogs. But yeah, the two people who are in my breakout room, Florian and Debbie, just going to double check it was Debbie and I'm not being stupid. Yeah, Debbie. They were saying they were a few chapters into the book and the blurb had interested them, but the first few chapters were a little different from the blurb. And just like I think some of the other people here were saying, everything feels so incredibly unpredictable and hard to follow. They were really curious to see where it was going to go next. Because a few chapters in is not so far into this book from what I remember reading. It's long and it's winding and yeah, totally unpredictable. And for the rest of the time in the breakout room, I think one of the things we talked about the most was what else our other encounters with Su Tong, be it in film adaptations of his works. Florian's read, or I guess has encountered him in the original Chinese. She's reading the book sort of bilingually, which is interesting. But also we were saying, or I think it was mostly me, to be honest, was mentioning that there's a lot of other English Su Tong out there, and that his sort of, what's the word? Apex, the point where he was biggest in the sort of world late consciousness has kind of passed. So there's this whole flush of Su Tong, other translated English Su Tong books from years back. So it's curious to know for who Shadow of the Hunter is their first Su Tong and who's a Su Tong veteran. For me, this was my first Su Tong. So yeah, I think that's, and if I was relaying anything else, I'd have to think really hard to remember it first. So I won't waste any more time.
I'd say to the readers who are only a couple of chapters in that I kind of share what you felt. I actually thought this isn't going to be that interesting as I did the first couple of chapters. They seemed quite, and then it takes off into this bizarre world. And takes you all over the place. Lots of very vivid images. So you're kind of lulled into a false sense of security or whatever by the opening, which is comparatively normal. But it gets weirder as you go. So persevere.
And what a book to blurb as well. Like, I think that, you know, if mine and James's struggles to describe it, it's also like, I think the blurb is really good, but I think that, you know, also it is a very different book, you know, in every way that you could never encapsulate. So what a hard thing to blurb for Daniel and Ying.
Martin, the editor, it was a continuous conversation, I believe, that blurb between James, myself, and Martin, and yeah, Martin had fun with that. Let's just say there was quite a few drafts. You're looking at probably the 80th version of that blurb.
Very much, very much. I saw Fan put in a couple of questions about the sort of like symbolic meanings in Grandpa's flashlight and Bayron's rope time, which I think, like, I guess, James, we didn't really come on to like far enough. And would anybody else like to talk about that at all, like what they saw in that, you know, and like the idea of there are these bones that are sort of his ancestors' bones that are the only relics left, and he's stored them in a flashlight, and then he's lost this flashlight, like where the batteries would go, which in itself is, you know, bizarre in itself. And did anyone sort of I don't know, Fan, what are your answers to that yourself?
Yeah, the reason why I asked this question, because very beginning, I didn't really felt these two things are related and they have any particular meanings. But then the more I read this book, I felt actually these two things are really important for this book. Because flashlight, right, especially like ancestors' bones, that's almost like history. I mean, China right now, we're kind of talking about, you know, a lot of history being rewritten, right? And the older generation, and they are desperate to have some kind of anchor in the culture, in the society. So finding flashlight, you know, and the grandpa surviving everybody at the end, right? He's the strongest at the end somehow, kind of means history. I think Su Tong kind of wanted to say, history is fundamental. It's really important. You know, even this community is very messy. Things are changing constantly, but history is there. There's something, there's some anchor there. Same for Bao Ren's generation, right? and it just everyone is kind of trying to find a way out, but the rope tying is trying to secure someone in a fixed position. To me, that almost kind of indicates that kind of desire. That desire also, that's another way to say we want some kind of anchor, right? So to me, it just kind of somehow this thought just came to me, and I kind of felt it was kind of really important. Even the mental hospital, it's kind of indicates like the society, just people are losing their mind in many ways.
Yeah, I think you're supposed to understand that the whole novel is set in a kind of mental asylum, symbolic. But the rope, though, I think the rope's interesting because in the end it doesn't work for him. True. It doesn't. Yeah, and his final use of it when he ties. Well, no, he comes back to it, but it never actually. It backfires on him. Well, so there's a futility there. But I think it's also it's kind of symbolic of an underlying innocence in that he has this rope and he which can be really threatening, but in the end it's not. He doesn't use it as malicious, or he backs away at the last moment from a really awful use of it. So I think it's kind of, we're supposed to understand that Balron's a bit like the rope in that he seems a very threatening character, but in fact there's a degree of innocence there. I think he's quite sympathetic in some ways, Balron. I mean, you certainly feel sorry for him, and you don't necessarily feel sorry for anybody else there apart from perhaps Grandpa.
And Miss Bay.
Yeah, I like that.
Well, I don't know. She's well, it depends on your point of view. I mean, she's a chancer and she gets away with what she can. But then I suppose she's been fundamentally changed by this this terribly traumatic. Though she's sort of nice and innocent to begin with, and then yeah. So yes, maybe one should feel sympathetic with her.
I think that's just a gorgeous point, Fan. I think that's stunning. I think that everything you said really, really resonated with me about sort of like actually, yeah, about the symbolism there.
Yeah.
Sorry, were you? Can I call on anyone else? Does Max or Mike or anyone like that like to speak? Hey, Max. Let me add you there.
Hello. Yeah, so I mean, what we were talking about really was again sort of the way Sutong uses humor, and you guys sort of touched on it before with the way that the way the rope is used in the sort of initially when it's in the hospital, like in a very sort of kind of comedic way, almost a way like the other people in there want to sort of use his services to be able to restrain the patients that they're sort of affiliated with, and the way it's sort of broached in the novel in the first place, where it's kind of like it emanates from a rumor, and you're kind of reading it thinking, oh right, yeah, no, that's ridiculous, and then you realize that it's actually true, and he does have this sort of talent, if you want to call it that, inverted commas. So, and also something else we were talking about on this humor aspect was, and I think Anna touched on this as well, about the soul and the sort of the way they sort of just casually offhand say, oh yeah, no, Granddad's lost his soul, and it's sort of you get a sense of the sort of cultural differences, if you like, between the older generation, generational differences really, and the way they sort of approach this as this thing that's sort of deadly serious, that they're worried about, and they don't want to sort of lose it, and the extent to which the granddad goes about trying to retrieve that by trying to dig up the bones of his ancestors, and yeah, so yeah, I think that was the thing that we really sort of honed in on, was just that sort of aspect of humor and unusual subjects in the way that Sutong approaches it is it's very interesting for the
There's a sort of pantomime element to that, with the descriptions of sort of smoke coming out of it. Sort of makes you think of genies and lamps and so on. And although if anyone could tell me what the snake's all about, I'd be very grateful. The house snake, very odd that. And also the sudden reappearance of the flashlight in the rafters. Suddenly, if you've forgotten about it, and suddenly it reappears. Very odd.
And then obviously she loses it in the river as well, and that's sort of like mad panic to get it. And
sort of French fast slamming doors and things. Yes, no, it's the more you think about elements of it, the sort of the absurd humor. Thank you, Angus.
It makes actually, like, for me, it made some subject matter that actually is really, really difficult to read actually accessible. I think that especially, you know, when you have a book about mental health and sexual assault, like this is, you know, I'm not normally going to walk through a bookshop and be like, aha, that's what I want to read. And that actually, like, we have a way here of engaging with the questions of sort of the impact of sexual assault, what sort of mental health provision care we do or don't have, and you know, how we approach that. And I actually think that, it makes it, the humour is needed in the same way that humour is needed in life, isn't it? You need it to get through. So if anybody else would like to say anything, please do pop a little note down in the chat and I'll get to you before the end. But as we're sort of coming up to 8 o'clock here, I thought we'd better do a little bit of a wrap up as we get here. So Daniel and I wanted to speak about a couple of things. One is we sort of want to set a proper time that suits everybody best for the book club for every month going forwards. So we've got a Twitter poll and also DM us. So my email's down below on the Eventbrite, or also Daniel's email. I think he said he accidentally sent it to everybody. So you also have Daniel's email, but you can also get me here to just sort of say when would suit you. But generally we're sort of, the poll has like weekends, weekdays, evenings, you know, how late you'd like it to be and all of that sort of thing. So if Daniel can link that in the chat, it would be really great if you could fill that out, and so we can set up a time that works for as many people as possible. But we also do record these, as you sort of seen, Daniel uploads them to the Sinoist YouTube channel afterwards, so if you ever have missed one you can catch up, or if you missed Lee's run last month you can have a catch up there and see it there. Daniel, your mechanical keyboard, I'm afraid.
Apologies. Yep.
He's got the most amazing mechanical keyboard, but it's rather noisy. So then we also wanted to talk about next month's January event is going to be Faces in the Crowd, translated by Olivia Milburn. She is currently in Korea, Daniel, is that right? Or was it Taiwan?
Yes, Korea.
She's currently in Korea, so we're slightly working out time specifically with her to make that happen, but the Eventbrite is there to link to sign up for immediately, and I'll also send it out in a follow-up email. And then if you would like to buy the book, there is a code CLRC UK 10 also in the chat, that gives you 10% off, and also gives you 10% off the subscription, which is a new thing Sinoist are doing. And over to Daniel to talk about the subscription.
Thank you very much for that, Caitlin. So I just thought I'd give a short little presentation about the subscription we put together. I mean, I think everyone sitting here is quite well versed in the kind of Chinese to English translation space, and I'm sure everyone's kind of well versed in what the shortcomings of it is. I mean, traditionally you get quite a lot coming out, admittedly, but they are kind of, some of them, like maybe they're a little bit lacking in translation quality, or maybe they only contribute to a narrow understanding of Chinese literature, or the problem is that maybe like they just don't get the rich diversity that is Chinese literature in quite across. So we put together a subscription scheme which essentially what we consider is translated by the best. So you get, for example, James and Honey today, they'll be the translators that'll be leading you through this. And then you'll get like our production team working on it, which have decades of experience working in China. And you'll be presented with these beautiful hardbacks, essentially. So Caitlin mentioned, thank you for that, the Faces in the Crowd. This is not one of the titles on the subscription scheme, but if you do purchase it, you get an idea of what the quality of the production is like. And you get to support essentially the best of what's coming up in Chinese literature. Now, other kind of small fringe benefits include kind of a 20% discount code off the this overall store. You get a bookmark, which is unique to this one. So right now we're working on the Shadow of the Hunter one right now. So you're gonna have to bear with me to believe that the foiling on this is gonna be gorgeous. And you get, for example, access to the events and advanced access to the books that are coming up in the subscription scheme ahead of everyone else. And also one of the things that we're pleased to announce today is a partnership with the translation charity Paper Republic, where essentially every purchase of a subscription we will contribute a donation towards the charity directly, which will help kind of support the ecosystem of Chinese to English translation, because they do fantastic work over there. Now, as final part of this, I'd like to give you a quick intro and a sneak peek into what we have. The next book coming up in the subscription is a book called The Sons of Red Bleak by Zhou Daxin. And we recently put together, I think it's actually done by Anna, actually. So it's a little animation, which I'd like to show you. So give me 1 second while I load that up. There you are.
Load that, Daniel. Faces in the Crowd in the subscription service.
Faces in the Crowd is not in the subscription service itself, but we do have another book coming up called A Looking Glass World, which is also by Feng Jicai, but it's on the subscription scheme as well.
And we will be coming to that book later in the year for book club as well. We've had a little sneaky plan of the next few months. So there will at least be one that comes up here, probably more. I think we're planning, if anyone would like to know, we're going to do some back catalogue books coming through in February, March as well. So if anyone has any other Sinoist books at home already, they might come up.
So here's the animation we put together. We're very excited about this one because we literally just finished the design process on the hardcover. The inside is going to be this white cloth bound book with kind of red foiling, and we're very looking forward to that. So yeah, very excited. So yeah.
So I think that's everything from us. Thank you so much everyone for joining us tonight, and especially for having such amazing thoughts and for contributing, and I really hope that you've enjoyed this evening. Thank you, James, in particular. Thank you, really enjoyed speaking to you. And it's been absolutely